Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar on building and infrastructure resiliency and human health impacts from smoke and fires. A very topical subject as spring is coming, and no doubt the forest fire season is going to be starting fairly soon. As you all know, this is a common occurrence across North America, and many buildings and structures and infrastructure components are damaged during forest fires. And this has caused huge challenges for building operators, owners, insurers, schools, hospitals, and anybody that occupies a building that has potential ventilation issues and damage issues. And as part of our practice at Pinchin, when we do this work in mitigation and management of forest fire impacts, we try and share our lessons with our community, i.e. all of you, so that we can all grow together and do this work better. So in that light, our webinar today brings together a group of experts who will discuss the health impacts of smoke exposure, how combustion byproducts move through buildings, and practical approaches for cleanup, mitigation, and also protecting buildings and infrastructure from future fire events. So with that, I'd like to move to the next slide, Erin, please, while I'll start to introduce our speakers, please.
Sounds great, John. I just wanted to address a few housekeeping items ahead of the start of the presentation. The chat has been turned off and microphones have been muted. The Q&A, however, remains open. Questions will be addressed throughout the presentation and then again at the end of the presentation. Additionally, following the presentation, recording will be emailed out to all participants, and so you can review at a later date or pass along. Thank you and enjoy the presentation, and back to you, John.
Thank you, Erin. Okay, my name is John Holland. I'm the Senior Advisor, Innovation and Corporate Programs at Pinchin, and I have been looking after these webinars for the last few years, and we try to evolve and grow these to suit the complex needs of our community and our clients and the regulators with whom we work to create a better environment. Next slide, please, Erin. So this is the broad agenda. We're going to talk about fire smoke, health effects, and regulatory considerations, how building smoke infiltrates buildings and how contamination is evaluated. And this relates to both forest fires and internally generated fires. And some fire-resistant building design and retrofit strategies so we can start to retrofit and build new buildings that can have a better fire mitigation design for the future. Next slide, please. So our presenters today, Mr. Chris Taylor, Mr. Stephen Booth, and Mr. John Runkle, who are both very well established and regarded senior professionals at Pinchin, who are going to be sharing their experiences with you today. Chris Taylor is our national practice leader for Pinchin in occupational and environmental health. He's been with the firm since 2005, and he's been the OHS practice leader since 2012. He has a diploma in electrical engineering technology from the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology, and he's a registered occupational hygiene technologist, and he's a member of the American Industrial Hygiene Association. He's got over 27 years of experience doing this kind of work, and he's managed over 4,000 projects, including many large-scale and complex projects where occupational and environmental health is an issue, including combustion events. He'll be the first speaker. The second speaker, and Chris is based in Edmonton, Alberta, is Steve Booth, who is our Executive Vice President for Indoor Environments and Hygiene in Southwestern Ontario and the Greater Toronto area. He's based in Southwest Ontario and Mississauga, and he's got more than 20 years of experience doing occupational hygiene, indoor environmental quality and infection control. And he's got a diploma in architectural technology, and he's developed standards for mold assessment and remediation in Ontario through the Environmental Abatement Council of Ontario. So very well experienced in this kind of work. And our third speaker is Mr. John Runkle, who is the Vice President of Pinchin's Building Science and Resiliency Group. Before joining Pinchin, John developed and led a building science solution team for 20 years at Intertech, a continent-wide US consulting company. He has a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from Pennsylvania State University, and he participates in many industry associations, including the Building Commissioning Association and the International Institute of Building Enclosure Consultants. He has extensive experience at expert witness work through storm damage claims and is an expert in building resiliency. He has a BSc in Civil Engineering from Pennsylvania State University. I think I mentioned that before, and he's a professional engineer. So with that, I would like to pass the lectern over to Chris Taylor to begin the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John, and welcome everybody. You'll see the note, you can post your questions at any time. Those that aren't speaking, we will be monitoring the Q&A throughout, although there'll also be an opportunity at the end for additional questions. As I start on health effects, I'm going to focus predominantly on wildfire health effects. So I'll talk a little bit about what I call event fire or building fire events. And the reason for that will hopefully become a little bit clearer. But whether it be wildfire or building fire events, there is just a wide variety of compounds. Building fire events have a much broader toxic soup, if you'd like to call it that. But in reality, most building fire events involve an evacuation, and so the continuous exposure is not typical. Whereas wildfire smoke can go on for days and can affect large portions of the country for extended periods of time. So I'm going to focus on wildfire smoke. So what are the things that are in wildfire smoke? And just like with building fires, this can vary quite a bit depending on the types of fire that is occurring, whether it's trees or bogs or for that matter, communities that are building. And it's a real mix of things. The closer you are to the fire, the greater the soup. A mixture of hydrocarbons and oxides of nitrogen, oxides of carbon, various particulate factors, and a whole group of things that we call polyaromatic hydrocarbons. Many of these things are cancer-causing, but all of them have a significant effect on the body, whether it be respiratory disease or distress, or just good old-fashioned irritation, but they all have a significant impact on health. And here's a little bit why I sort of focus more on the wildfire event, especially from a building operations point of view as to impact, is because these wildfire plumes can migrate enormous distances. Now, the further away you are from the fire, the soup tends to be a little bit, less soupy. It tends to be mostly a mixture of particulates. Those particulates can be simply components of the trees, can have things like silicon, metals, and so on. There will also be some polyaromatic hydrocarbons that are attached to the particulate and soot and sort of carbonaceous materials. But it's this idea that the small particulate can migrate for such distances, and therefore a fire in one part of the country can have a significant impact to large parts of the population in other parts of the country. And the reason for that is really the size. Here's a really good sort of layout. You can see at the top end of the scale there a human hair down to, we see that PM 2.5 particle way down towards the left-hand side. And then you can see wildfire smoke even smaller, in fact, smaller than bacteria. And so when you have these very, very small particles, they can stay airborne for extraordinarily long periods of time and extraordinary distances. And this impact can be quite significant. So let's kind of see an example that I'm sure all of you have experienced in the last few years.
Right now at 4, we begin with our weather alert. You are looking live at some pictures of the hazy sky that has hung over us all day. Smoke from Canadian wildfires is creating very unhealthy air for us right here at home. We appreciate you being with us at 4 o'clock. I'm Marisa Vader here with meteorologist David Yeomans, and we were all excited to get some relief from the heat, right? And we did get that, except unfortunately it's tough to open the windows when you've got this unhealthy air.
It's come with this smoke right when we want to get outside. This is what Oak Brook has looked like all day. Time lapse showing the smoke. You can see smoke here in the sphere windows behind me as well. I want to take you down to the floor though, Marie, because this really shows a good representation of where this smoke is coming from and how it's actually visible right now from space. Look at this. These bright white colors here, this band of cloud cover, not what I'm looking at. Instead, let's go up here, northwest of Chicago. This hazy kind of murky color on the satellite picture, this is all Canadian wildfire wildfire smoke, and you can see how it's filtering down from Canada, Wisconsin, and Minnesota directly into our area. This is smoke that we will not only have to deal with today, but we now may have to deal with it all through the coming week.
So those particular plumes were coming from northern Manitoba, and I'm quite confident that all of you at one time or another have had significant impact. We, as John indicated at the beginning, as we move into spring, I'm based in Alberta. The official wildfire season started 2 weeks ago, and already are starting to look at planning and fighting some of those fires. And the reality is, since Slave Lake in 2011, there have been major significant wildfire events in North America every year, and in many cases in regions of the country that have never had them before, like in Bedford, in Nova Scotia last year, let alone California, let alone Fernie, Slave Lake, Fort McMurray, Jasper. It's just now a thing. And so from a health perspective, Health Canada has then looked into this and to sort of focus in on, if this is now going to be a common event, if this is now going to be a thing, what are the impacts, and just what should we be concerned about, and how should we be thinking of health as we move into the future, where these events are more likely to increase, not decrease. And so the studies that Health Canada and other research organizations have done have focused on a variety of different things, particularly particulate. Now, the health effects can be very simple. They can simply be irritation. They can lead to headaches and other components. But if you are a compromised individual, the very young, the very old, those that already have respiratory disease or distress, those that have cardiovascular pre-existing conditions, all of these things are going to have a significant impact on your health, and ultimately, in some cases, lead to death. And so I'm sure all of you during these events have seen the recommendations. Steve Booth will be talking a little bit on the measurement side of things, that when you trigger an event based on your measurements, what should you do? And that's why we're going to focus on buildings, because the most common recommendation is to shelter indoors, that the best place for you during a smoke event is going to be indoors. These health effects, based on some additional studies, and these were done both in Canada and looking at data from all over North America, that prior to 2018, you were looking at somewhere between 2,400 short-term and 2,500 long-term premature deaths. And a very significant cost implication, whether it be close to $2 billion in acute healthcare costs, or close to $20 billion in chronic healthcare costs. These things have significant impact to our system. Then when they looked at the real significant uptick in events from 2019 to 2023, we found that those impacts were even more so. They were almost a doubler. This study is available for review online, and it really looks at just the significant impact, particularly for a chronic aspect, and the impact to our healthcare system. And in fact, a study done based on the California wildfires, they looked not only at the direct costs related to damaged infrastructure and buildings and so on, but the indirect costs related to health and other components, whether they be those fighting the fires, but all those impacted. And you can see that's an awfully big number. For 4 years of wildfire, you're looking at, in the trillions of dollars. And it is that aspect that we want to focus in on, and that idea that this can be a major significant event. So as a building owner or a building operator, then why do you have to do something? If this is something happening outdoors, you don't have any control over it. If you're a building operator, you're not going out and fighting fires. The reason for that is that basically every jurisdiction has what we call a general duty clause, some sort of clause within health and safety legislation that says that your ultimate requirement as an employer is to protect the worker. Most jurisdictions also have other legislation that says if you're a building owner, you also have a responsibility to the occupants of your building. And it all comes down to something that we call the ALARA clause, or as low as reasonably achievable, that you must keep exposures to as low as reasonable achievable levels. And then when you have jurisdictions like federal jurisdictions that adopt aspects such as ASHRAE and the ASHRAE requirements for indoor air quality, ASHRAE being the American Society for Heating, Refrigerating, and Air Conditioning Engineers, you have a major significant requirement. You have a duty to protect your occupants from exposures to these significant health events. There's also commercial aspects as well. If you're a building owner operator and you're trying to differentiate yourself from other buildings, being able to point to air quality controls, enhanced air quality impacts that Stephen Booth's going to talk about is going to separate you from those building other operators. So I really want to emphasize there are significant health effects, and I'm now going to pass it on to Stephen Booth, who's going to talk to you how that happens and how to evaluate these components.
Hi, Chris. Thanks, Chris, and good morning, everyone. Yeah, so I'm going to spend the next few slides talking a little bit about forecasting wildfire smoke in your area, planning so that you're managing that smoke correctly, and then, in the worst case, if there are actually impacts to the building, what might you be looking for, and what might that sort of reopening process look at? So if we go to the next slide. So, in Canada, one of the greatest tools we have for monitoring ambient air quality is the Air Quality Health Index. So Health Canada published this, and they published this for just about every small city and town in Canada. So if you access that link there and you live in Sudbury, Ontario, or Kelowna, or wherever you are across the country, you can find an air quality health index that's updated twice a day for your specific geographic location. So the air quality health index is not specifically designed around wildfire smoke, but what it looks at are PM 2.5, ozone, and oxides of nitrogen. So the PM 2.5 and the NO2, specifically Chris mentioned, those are components of wildfire smoke. So when we see wildfire smoke entering a geographic location, we see it immediately start impacting this air quality health index. So this is an excellent tool that you can use both to see current and forecasted impacts of wildfire smoke and other air quality issues in your geographic area. So it's very, very useful. There is a WeatherCan app that you can download for your iPhone or your Android device. So, you don't have to be at your desk getting this information. You can be getting updates daily on the phone. I'll also say that it's an excellent weather app. So if you just like following the weather, it's one of the better weather apps out there. If we go to the next slide. So that Air Quality Health Index gives you a certain set of metrics. Another great forecasting tool is firesmoke.ca. So the firesmoke.ca presents you a screen that looks very similar to what you see here. And it shows the locations of various wildfires burning across Canada, and it shows where those plumes are heading. And just like an animated weather map, it'll show where that plume smoke is expected to go over the next 24 to 48 hours. So you can check that on an intermittent basis during wildfire season. You can see, hey, we're not in the smoke now, but I see that smoke's going to wrap around to my community in the next day or week. And then you can start potentially a planning process on how you're going to manage that. Next slide. So the third piece of this kind of monitoring puzzle and understanding are actually direct particulate monitoring at your project site. So the two tools before give you sort of geographic ideas of what's going on in your general area. Monitoring directly in your building can provide you very specific on-site data that then you can use to to direct how you act to control and mitigate that impact on the occupants. So, on the left-hand side of the screen is a continuous reading instrument. So, these can be installed at various locations throughout the building, outside the building, inside air intakes, various occupied spaces on the floor. And then it can provide you a continuous reading of PM 2.5 concentrations. And then in addition to that, there are a variety of different handheld instruments that building operators can have and can deploy, prior to an event and during an event to kind of monitor how the situation's going and potentially to monitor when they could start removing procedures. The little graphic you can see across the bottom is actually from Pynchon's active IAQ system. And these are PM 2.5 sensors that we had in our British Columbia offices a couple of years ago during a wildfire smoke event. And you can see, a very steep rise as the wildfire smoke sort of came into the area where those offices were, directly impacted air quality, and then dropped off again. This is nice for two reasons. One, it shows you those spikes when the impacts are happening, but it also gives you the baseline of what's normal in your building. So you can see, for much of the year, we're sitting very low concentration. It's only really during these wildfire events that we see the numbers rise up dramatically. So it's a really strong signal of when you can act to take action to mitigate those impacts on building occupants. Next slide. So, okay, we've got this idea that there's this air quality health index and there's some numbers involved in that. I can take PM 2.5 measurements. I get some numbers there. What do those numbers mean? When do I use them? How do I use them? Well, so Health Canada's looked at those air quality health index numbers and created a low, moderate, high, and very high range. So 1 to 3 low, 4 to 6 moderate, 7 to 10 high, and very high. And those roughly, there's no direct equivalency between those and PM 2.5 measurements you might do in your building, but there's some general sort of ideas of what roughly line up. Remember, the air quality health index is more than just PM 2.5. It's taking multiple parameters into consideration. But sort of the 0 to 30, 31 to 60, 61 to 100, and greater than 100 are roughly equivalent if you're taking spot measurements or continuous monitoring measurements in your building. And then each one of those levels can trigger different actions. So you're in that low range, run the building as normal. Everything you would normally do, you do normally. Once you start to get into the moderate, maybe we start to reduce the amount of outdoor air that's coming into the buildings. We seal up some openings. If it's an apartment building, multi-tenant residential, for instance, with operable windows, an advisory to keep the windows closed during that period starts in moderate. And then at higher, we bring in, additional precautions, perhaps occupant advisories or enhancing filtration. And then we're in these very high levels. We may be looking at dedicated clear air spaces within a building, or potentially relocating occupants or suggesting people don't come into work on those days. So those are the sort of the levels of action that are required, and roughly how those AQ, HI, and PM 2.5 concentrations correlate. Next slide. So if you have your phone with you right now and you scan the QR code, or later when this comes down to you, we've put together sort of a really kind of rough checklist that can help you in very sort of preliminary planning purposes on what you can do during a wildfire smoke event. I mean, ultimately, if we move to the next slide. Ultimately, there are a couple of documents from ASHRAE, so ASHRAE 44, and this guidance for cleaner airspaces during wildfire smoke events from Health Canada. Both of these documents give very sort of detailed advice on how to develop a smoke management program for your facility. So a program that understands those predictions and those levels, and then, translates into direct action for you to undertake to minimize the risk to the occupants in your building. So if we move on to the next slide, what do those plans look like? The goal of the plan is really to protect the building itself, so protect that infrastructure. If we get a lot of smoke contamination comes in, maybe we have to spend a lot of time and energy cleaning that up after. So that's something that we want to avoid. And we want to create a safe space for the people that are in the building. So both the documents sort of lay out what's required in roughly similar ways. So, a section of who does what during the emergency is not when you want to be deciding who's going to do what as part of a plan. So lay those roles and responsibilities out in advance. Figure out what you need to do in the pre-season so that, I order the supplies I might need. I get an extra set of filters for the building. If I have air scrubbers on site, do they need maintenance? Do they need their filter change? Make sure we take care of those things in advance. Understand how I'm going to operate the building differently during a fire than not during the smoke. So how do I control my economizers so that they're not automatically engaging and bringing in fresh air for free cooling during a wildfire event, which would be really detrimental to air quality in the building. So how do I operate that building in smoke mode? How do I communicate with the tenants of the building? How do I communicate with others in my organization about how I'm managing the building? So writing those communication protocols down in advance. How do I get back to normal? Okay, the fires happened. We did a bunch of stuff. We told tenants they should stay inside. Now it's changed. So how do we sort of roll back that plan and get back to normal? And then it really is a section that looks at that plan at least once a year and says, hey, these are the things we did and they worked. These are the things we did and they didn't work. Now I need to make some continuous improvement to that plan so that I can have it work better and better year to year. Next slide. So last year, Pynchon had the opportunity to be involved in some communities in northern Manitoba that had been very significantly impacted by wildfire smoke, not actually in the fire itself, but smoke impacts through a number of public sector buildings. The public sector buildings had actually been closed because of the extent of the wildfire smoke for a period of time. And there was a team of professionals engaged to sort of go into the building, have a look around and understand, what might need to be done to get people back into the hospital or the school or the government office building, whatever they happen to be. And so, what we discovered through that investigation program process was that the impacts inside the building are highly variable. That depends on, what type of building it is. It depends on how the building was being operated, how the HVAC was being operated, what the occupant activities were. So we saw within the same community, significantly different levels of impact depending on the building and the building's use. What we found pretty consistently was the air quality in a building goes back to normal very, very quickly after the fire. So once there's no sort of smoke and odor and high levels of particulate outside, with the HVAC system operating, that outdoor air circulates through the building and things come back to normal from a spot measurements for carbon monoxide and PM 2.5 and NO2 and all those kind of things all sort of very rapidly go back to normal. What we did find, though, is that there's a persistent level of contamination on surfaces from time to time. So it really just suggests that there is this need to go in where there's been an impact and look closely at what's impacted the building and how to go to next step. So next slide now, Aaron, you were just 2 seconds ahead of me. So what are the things that we're looking for? Like this stuff that settles out on surfaces, what is it? And Chris, I think, alluded to this in his initial discussion. Really, we're seeing that soot particulate as being the primary material. So, that very small microscopic soot travels thousands of kilometers from the fire source. It's very, very small. It can work its way through cracks, around penetrations in filters and work its way through the building and cause deposition in the building. So that's number one, is that soot particulate. Number two, char and ash. So char is essentially little pieces of trees or leaves that have been burned. So there's just carbon left and nothing else, but they haven't really been broken down into the elemental, little tiny, very small pieces of carbon. So that's char. And then ash are, you know, the non-carbon components, the chemical components that are left over. If you think about a campfire in the summer, you know, all of the wood that you burn in the campfire disappears up in the air, really as soot. So it all that elemental carbon goes up in the air and goes away. And then you end up in the fire pit with the char and ash. So the char, the little pieces that are left that didn't get blown away by the fire and the air movement that the fire created. And then the white particulate is the ash that gets deposited. So those two things don't typically travel as far from the fire, and we don't normally see them as part of deposition in buildings. And then with that soot particulate come those PAHs that Chris talked about. And they bind to the soot particulate and they pose a carcinogenic risk on surface. So it's important to understand what's deposited, if it's deposited in unusual concentrations, and then clean where those concentrations are above background levels. And next slide. So one of the things that Pynchon has worked on over the last 5 years, and that really there isn't good information on anywhere, is what sort of background deposition of combustion residues look like in Canadian buildings. And over the past 5 years, Pynchon's taken roughly 500 samples for tapeless samples and hundreds of wipe and PAH samples to kind of understand what's normal in a building. And, you know, in our mind, if you can answer what's normal in a building, then you can go in post-fire and test and say, hey, this isn't what we normally see, so it's very likely an impact in that case. And what we found is you don't find soot particulate on regularly cleaned surfaces in buildings, period. So if you go in and take tapeless screening samples from desks and countertops and someone's computer and those kind of things, stuff that people wipe down on at least a semi-regular basis, we don't see combustion particulate. So it's a really cheap, quick, easy way to determine whether there's been impacts, is that kind of screening samples. A little more detailed are TEM samples. So you can do analysis by transmission electron microscopy and understand precisely how much soot is there. And what we found is that in buildings, there isn't more than trace amounts, even in historic settled dust in buildings, where even in those historic settled dust locations, less than 1% soot by TEM. And then if you're seeing more than that, a good indication that there's been an impact. And when it comes to PAHs, particularly the high molecular PAHs that really come from combustion, and which coincidentally are also some of the more carcinogenic, like benzoate-pyrene, those simply are not present in our wipe samples from inside buildings. So if you start to see those present in buildings at any measurable level, then those are very strong indications that there's been an impact from the fire and something that will require a cleanup. Next slide. So when we look at sort of the overall, the work that we did, you really want to have an integrated approach to the monitoring. So the indoor air quality is important because you do want to document certainly that those numbers have come back to normal levels before people access the building. But you also want to do that surface measurement so that you can understand what that cleaning scope, whether a cleaning scope is necessary and what it might be. You want to have a targeted cleaning scope. You don't want to just have to do every single surface in a building. So you want to understand that that deposition might be irregular and have testing done from specific areas so that you can target your cleanup. You want to be able to collect all that information as documentary evidence so that it can support an insurance claim, so that it can reassure people coming back into the building that that cleanup has been done. And then, you know, really all of that ties into, and on the next slide, we really talk about the proactive risk management piece of it. If we move to the next slide, which is really this idea that we need to be proactively managing the smoke to begin with, so we don't end up in a situation where we need to be doing cleaning later. If we have a proper smoke management plan in place, we're looking at those monitoring tools and triggers, we're implementing smoke mode operations when they need to be implemented, and really following those ASHRAE 44 and Health Canada ideas, then hopefully that closes up our building well enough that we have very little impact post-fire, and that kind of testing that we did in northern Manitoba, if it needs to happen, it doesn't lead us to situations where we need to do substantial cleanup efforts. And with that, I will hand things over to John Runkle.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris and Steve, and thank you all for joining us today. Hopefully you're finding this worthwhile use of your time, and I'll bring it home for you here. If you think about it, what we're going to talk about today is a little bit more of the physics behind some of the fires and so forth. And we're talking about the built environment, and more specifically, we're talking about how our buildings create this separation between outside and inside. So specifically, if we look at the world, we know that our weather patterns change, and we're asking a lot of our building enclosures. And when I talk about building enclosures, we're talking about things like roofs, walls, windows. It's all of the materials, air barriers, and so forth that separate outside from inside. And you heard it from Chris, and you heard it from Steve. I think Steve even said the word, fresh air, which for the purpose of this talk is really the point. So when outside is not fresh, when inside is fresh, it kind of flips our understanding of what where healthy is and what we're trying to achieve. And I think the essence, when it comes to the smoke, we're really talking about, how do we make the office or this building that we all work on or operate the safest. But when you're comparing it to outside or even their home residence where they spend time. So we put these barriers in place, these roofs and walls and windows and so forth, to keep outside out and inside in. And so we're talking about heat and water and sound, and in this case, fire and smoke. And we were really trying desperately to have that building enclosure keep those things out of our interior occupied space. So when you look at the physics of it, nature wants to achieve equilibrium. So if it's hot, it wants to go to cold. If it's wet, it wants to go to dry. If it's high, it wants to go to low pressure. And we're putting these boundaries in to prevent that equilibrium from occurring. So we're trying to really create a separation, a difference in exterior from interior. And that's in everyday life and also in times of tragedy. We've also changed the way that we've built considerably over the years. When you look at the perhaps simple building materials from yesterday's, masonry and stone and mortar, maybe some wood, and now we've made things very complex with glass and glazing and sealants and membranes and all of these materials that we use today, concrete and steel, that weren't part of traditional construction. And then you think about, all the trades that went into that, not just to build the building, but you look at all the systems and all the people that are necessary to run the building, and how these systems interact. So unfortunately, the slide looks like a mess, and it's intended to be like a mess, because when you look at the HVAC system, how does it interface with the lighting system? How does it interface with the security system or the plumbing system or the enclosure systems? And the reality is, when you have times of natural disasters, all of these systems, there's a ton of interdependency and interconnectivity. And if you have failure of one system, likely you're going to have failure of all systems, which really complicates things. So specifically looking at fire, and it's important to do that because we spent a lot of time today talking about smoke. This is going to speak a little bit more to the fire side of things. It's called the fire tetrahedron for a reason. There's 4 components of that. There's a fuel component, there's an oxygen and a heat component, and then all of that has to start with a chemical reaction, which is typically referred to as the ignition source, which starts this chemical reaction. And so when we're looking at traditional ways to prevent fires, obviously if you can prevent the ignition source from occurring, or if you can remove oxygen, and we do that with like applying foams and so forth, or blankets. You can remove the heat. We do that by applying water, traditional firefighting. or the fuel is very difficult, but we'll talk about some of those things and how we can maybe do landscaping and removing brush and so forth to reduce fuel loads. But those are traditional ways that we've done to kind of reduce either the chemical reaction from starting or those three pieces. Now, I think if you step back and we're thinking about buildings and we're thinking about fires and we're thinking about the modern era, maybe not going back as far as like the Chicago fire or things like that. You think about things like the unfortunate tragedy at the Grenfell in England. There's also been several tragedies in the Middle East where I've worked extensively. And when you look at these, you can ask yourself, well, how come we don't see these in the States? And it's not because we don't have fires in Canada or the States. What we don't see these whole-scale building cladding fires generally. And there's lots of reasons for that. One, we have more compartmentalization within our designs, meaning that it's more difficult for fires to go from one section of a building to another or one floor of a building to another. We usually have fully sprinkled buildings, so you can get some very active fire suppression support from that. The lack of combustible panels is the big one. A lot of these fires have a link, and that is that there is a foam core in these metal panels that really rapidly transmitted fires vertically. And you saw, the buildings that would just catch on fire very rapidly before the suppression could really take an effect. We also have maybe some different fire department capabilities and some different smoke control and HVAC isolation techniques that are more common in the States than other parts of the world. So when you look at, after an event, and Steve touched on this a little bit kind of on the insurance side and also the fire cause and origin side, you've already lost, obviously, if the building's caught on fire, but there are things that can help that not be as big of a loss and so forth. When you look at the traditional first step that's going to happen, there's going to be a fire cause and origin. And they're going to, basically see what caused the initial source, what caused the fire, and ultimately, in some ways, who's at fault. So there's this whole forensic investigative process that goes in. And they're looking for things like arson and other things like that because that has significant insurance implications. There's other insurance implications too. Obviously, you're paying a premium to have insurance. Certainly, there's a risk of those premiums going up. But it also may go down if you can show proactively, addressing some of the risk, because that's all insurance is it's just paying money to help supplement or share risk. And then you can look at payments on the claim and so forth. You can get in the unfortunate position with fire, just like you can with flood or lava flows or tsunamis or a lot of these other types of natural disasters that are very devastating, very quick acting, where it may actually dictate whether you can rebuild or not with some of the decisions that you make ahead of time. And you can have forced code upgrades. Most of the buildings that we deal with that have significant losses have some type of code upgrade because at the time the building was built, it's not in compliance with current code, and now you have to do not only building back the way it was, but you have to do extra things to make it compliance with current codes. And so when you look at some of our fires, and we talked about some California fires, you can see that a lot of these fires are what we call slab losses. And when you have a slab loss, these are things that are really going to hit you. What is substantial damage? What does that mean about your ability to build back? What does that mean just because you got payment for the amount maybe of the insurance in this case, but does that mean that you actually have enough money to do the things you do to get back into that building, whether it's a residence or a commercial space? And so the same things that we've seen in Hawaii, we've seen in Jasper, and unfortunately these fires hit quickly, and oftentimes the damage is completely devastating, where there really isn't much to go with once that fire hit. Now, we do have some examples of some success. It's not all gloom and doom. And so this might not look like success, but I think it's the devil's in the details. And if you've been working around natural disasters, as I have, almost exclusively for the last 7 years, you really start to see the little things making big differences. And so this is an example of one of these little things after the devastating fires in California. Yes, the house, largely as was consumed in the fire, but when you look, the concrete foundations remain. And so the ability to just go in and start building a new house on top of a foundation that still remains is huge, and will shave months, if not maybe a year, off of the rebuilding schedule, because that foundation was made of concrete and robust materials that withstood the fire much more than the rest of the residents did. We talked about before, I think Steve did a good job of kind of outlining, some of the risks for fire and so forth. But I think it's also important to see that our maps have been changing. And so, in this case, the old map of LA versus the new map of LA look very different in terms of what, the computer modeling and the experts tell you where the greatest fire risks are. But you also heard from both Chris and Steven that just because you're not in the burn zone or maybe the red zone in this case, you still have a risk of fire. And certainly when it comes to smoke, you're still well within the target area. But it's very difficult, because if you look what we're actually trying to do, when we talk about a structure or a building, we're trying to actually turn our building into a fireplace. That is something that's intended to be next to fire and not be consumed, that's made out of construction materials. And so it's a very difficult thing to do. I would say it's as difficult as it is with the flood mitigation that we do on a regular basis. So let's take a look at some strategies for doing that. First of all, the traditional strategies, I would say the important thing to note too is it's not just do one or two of these strategies. You really need to do everything, because fire will attack the weakest link in the chain. And if you have a weak link that allows that fire and heat to access the interior of the structure, then you're going to lose. So it's a Class A roof, metal, stone, concrete, tile. The facade, looking at things like fiberboard or concrete, masonry type materials. When you look at glazing, looking at metal and multi-panel tempered glazing rather than maybe wood or plastic type glazing assemblies. When you look at insulation, rock wool is usually going to be the one source that you can have reasonable assurance is going to withstand fire better. And then looking at ember resistant vents and some things that are really important, and we'll see some examples of that as we go forth, as well as examples of defensive perimeter establishment. So when you look at that, this goes back to that fire tetrahedron, and we were talking about the fuel load, and not just the fuel load, but the fuel load in proximity to your building, your office building, your residence, or so forth. So the more load that you can get removed away from it, the lower the heat, the lower the flames are going to be, the direct flames that'll be affecting the residents. And probably you're going to lower the amount of time that those flames are there, which will give materials a better chance of performing. And so obviously removing brush and so forth is a common strategy. This is an important example to look at. And I think after every natural disaster, there's a heightened awareness of the success of these islands or these oases of success within, a field of devastation. Now you can see some mature trees in the background that weren't consumed, so that might give an indication that, perhaps there was differences in exposure here. But you can see that there was one completely burned out structure, within a few meters of a structure that largely looks untouched. And so where did this success come from? And I think it's important to look at the details and overlay some of the learnings that we just had. So there's no eaves for one. Maybe architecturally you could question, maybe some of the characters gone, but from an engineering perspective, the lack of eaves, the lack of vents, probably were the main reasons why this building is relatively untouched and the neighbors are destroyed. So it does create a different aesthetic, but you're going to have a relatively sealed buildings and sealed fenestration. The landscaping is minimal, but actually still intact there. And then there's a big wall around the property, which again, maybe not the most inviting, but very effective in this case in protecting the property. And those are kind of passive ways that we can reduce the fire exposure or the risk of fire exposure. But when you look at the active strategies, obviously the detection and the alarming, the planning, which Stephen spoke about at length, and then looking at sprinkler systems and backup power, maybe movable shutters, and then other maybe more novel technologies like the use of intumescent paints or gels or foams or blankets that would be automatically deployed under certain circumstances. Again, all examples of active fire suppression, which would be in conjunction with the passive protection that's already in place. And you heard real good detail from Chris that not all smoke is created equal, and I think it's important for us to remember that. And so when we look at it, and also the fact that smoke has an effective range of several hundred kilometers, if not 1,000 kilometers away from the source, and still affecting buildings. So some strategies for controlling smoke, and you did hear Steve touch upon some of these as well. But having an effective air barrier, putting the airflow or almost all the airflow through HVAC systems is incredibly important. So if you have a leaky enclosure, windows, roofs, or whatever, that's all examples of air that's coming into the building that's not being treated by the HVAC, and you really don't have a chance at that. If it goes outside of the filtration systems or cleaning systems, you've given up your ability to control that. And you want to limit the ability of occupants to alter the performance of the building, such as like operable windows and so forth, which obviously could wreak havoc if you're trying to clean air. If you think back to Chris's slide, he had a slide there that had dust particles. If you recall, the dust particles were not very large on the scale of particle size. I think they were in right at that 2.5 range. So this is an example in Phoenix, not of a fire, but of a dust storm that's coming in. But when you look at the techniques for keeping smoke out, it's essentially identical to the techniques to keeping dust out. And so this is not an isolated problem. It's not linked to just one type of exposure and fire. This is something that large parts of North America have to deal with on a regular basis. Again, it's turning off air intakes, closing, openings and vents and so forth, securing loose equipment, making sure your filters are changed and cleaned. And again, trying to get a difference between that interior and exterior air quality. So when we look at, kind of an office building, it's the same thing. This is just a visualization of what we've seen, but it all starts with the sealed enclosure. If you don't have a sealed enclosure, you don't have a chance, because again, the mechanical systems can only treat the air that they see, and air that bypasses those systems is going to be essentially untreated in that case. So again, when we look at some of those ways to bypass the systems, entry doors and so forth, any kind of door or operable fenestration is a weak spot. You can look at vents and dampers and so forth on HVAC system as a weak spot. And again, what we're trying to do is to get all of the air coming through these intentional treatment places at the HVAC, and we're trying to stop the air from flowing around a window in this example and so forth. So you say, okay, great, John, that's wonderful, but how do we do that? You might have a new building coming out that you want to be proactive on. You might have an existing building, and you say, hey, look, we want to do better than the average. We want to provide a safe environment. We want, this office building or this manufacturing facility to be the safest place that our employees can go, even safer than their homes. And when you look at doing that, you can feel a little helpless sometimes. So one of the processes you can do is called commissioning. In this case, commissioning of the building enclosure. You would also commission the HVAC systems and so forth. And this commissioning can be done either as a retrofit or it can be done after the fact. But it starts with a review of the design, whether it's an existing building design or the design as it's being constructed, if it's new construction. And so if you look at that, you can basically see where the weak spots were. Hopefully, if it's new construction, you can avoid some of those weak spots. Or if it's an existing building, this design review can help focus on where the problematic areas likely are. As Steve did a great job of saying, you really want to look at quantitative testing whenever possible. You want to have verifiable results, and verifiable results are things that you can measure. And there's a lot of ways that we can measure or test to make sure that our enclosures are tight. And so you see a couple examples on the screen here. You have whole building air testing, which actually provides a quantitative result. You also see some smoke testing, which is more qualitative, but this is actually putting pressurized smoke in a bag on the outside and trying to force it through that building. You can see the example of IR, which can be helpful in finding leaks and so forth. And these are just some examples on some of the testing and actual quantitative performance values you can get from using this commissioning process on new or existing buildings. So you said, okay, John, this is great. I see, I understand the risk and so forth, but why is not everybody doing this? In fact, why are most people not willing to pay for it? And I will tell you, from a 3-time survivor of a flooding event, if it's not top of mind, if people haven't experienced a direct impact from them, a loved one, employees, from a natural disaster, it's very hard for people to get motivated that this is a real risk that's going to hit him or hit them. I will say that almost everybody that I've talked with wish they would have done more after the fact. And so, how do we bridge that gap, or why does that gap exist in actually doing things proactively versus not? And so let's take a look at that. I think, some of it can be, almost political in some ways. And I will assure you that natural disasters do not care how you vote. And so when you hear terms like resiliency consulting and so forth, I think sometimes people think, well, I don't know if I kind of believe in maybe, global warming or things like that. That has nothing to do with what we're talking about here. And I think it's important to kind of look at this as this is just physics at work. And this is also risk management. This is also discussions where we're looking at, premiums changing. There's other financial implications. And I think there's not a lot of good education out there about what is the value of doing things proactively here. Maybe what's the rate of return on investment, or maybe even how can you save money from, reducing risk and so forth and being proactive on some of these things. So when we look at it, resiliency is really focused on being prepared and recovery and adaptation, where sustainability is different. And that's looking at, achieving long-term targets and being environmentally responsible. And so, yes, there are some linkages between the two, but we're really focused on resiliency when it comes to here. And specifically, what we're really trying to do is time to get your life back. And Steve hit on this point, and it's a great point where, I can tell you from being a natural disaster survivor, the most important thing is, what is the time until you are living and enjoying that work or residential space again? When are you back to normal? When do you have basic functionality? That's what matters. It matters even more so than a lot of other things. I mean, obviously, if you can control that time, and I would say if you do nothing, you can't control that time. But if you do plan and you implement some of these strategies, you can really control that time. And that will make a world of difference between you and everybody else that's dealing with the same thing as to how long it takes for you to get back to your normal. And the best advice I can give you is, don't be overconfident. Taking no action to protect your property, and this should say people as well, is very, very sobering after the fact. And I can tell you many examples of people that wish they would have done more, or didn't see the risk, or didn't believe that it could happen to them, or had done some things but not nearly enough, but believed it was going to be enough. And it can be the difference, between your livelihood. It can be the difference between you and your loved ones enjoying that space, or financial ruin in some cases. So I don't mean to end on a sour note, but you can control this, and there are more tools, and you're not helpless. And I think that's the important thing. And you can look at us as a partner to help you get through reducing some of this risk. So we appreciate your patience, and sorry we went a little bit long today, but we'll take questions